From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being so patient. We finally got in here. Welcome to this pre-concert discussion. My name is Norman Middleton. I'm one of the concert producers here at the library, and it's my pleasure to present to you tonight's artists, Tyondai Braxton, and Wordless Orchestra Artistic Director Ronen Givony. Would you please welcome them? And let me start. Ronen, I'm going to start with you. Wordless music. What does that mean in terms of what you do, and how did you come up with that concept for your concert series?
The Wordless Music Orchestra is basically the house band of the Wordless Music series, which in September will be 5 years old. And we have mainly done concerts in New York, but also select cities such as San Francisco, Minneapolis, Boston, Berlin, Washington. And the idea is basically, you know, you have on one hand classical music concerts, which from the first note to the end is essentially one fixed style of just classical music. And then you have rock concerts, which also from the first note of the opening band is a pretty consistent style. And the idea behind the series was just to kind of mix and match styles and genres that might not necessarily go next to each other ordinarily. So if you have a rock band, if you have a DJ or an electronic music artist, instead of having another rock band open for them or another kind of laptop electronic music guy, to have a string quartet, to have a solo piano, to have an orchestra performance such as tonight.
And what does the title mean? We all know songs without words, Mendelssohn and all that kind of stuff. But how does that figure into what you do? Why did you pick that title?
You know, originally the title Wordless Music was meant to imply kind of a neutral space between classical music per se and shall we say instrumental rock, instrumental jazz. At the beginning we only booked performers who, you know, played literally completely wordless music, and since then we have kind of learned to chill out a little bit and to invite pop groups and punk rock groups, and the idea is basically anyone making kind of interesting progressive music to put them into a context slightly different than they're used to and their audience is used to.
Mm-hmm. And I like that you won the 2008 Village Voice Best of New York City Award for Best Moderately Snooty Concert Series. Now, I'm assuming that the voice is being sort of, you know, tongue-in-cheek, but it brings up an important point for what you and Tyondai do for a living. When you're designing a concert series, and you can jump in on this too, Tyondai, are you necessarily trying to unsnoot your audiences, or do you care, or does it matter to you?
Well, it's funny, when Wordless Music won that award, I got the same email from maybe 15 of my friends, which just goes to show you how well they know me, and they said, you know, they got this wrong. The fact that they had the word moderately snooty just kind of disqualifies it. But I mean, the idea is basically that, you know, there are all sorts of interesting artists around today, whether it's someone like Bjork or David Byrne or Radiohead or, you know, Tyondai, who their background is very much, you know, you can tell that they've listened to 20th century jazz, 20th century improvised music, experimental rock music, but they also very much have a background in modern composition, whether it's people like Debussy and Stravinsky and Bartok. And so, you know, if there was kind of an unspoken subtitle to all these concerts, you know, the idea is if you like Bjork's music, you might like Messiaen. If you like Tyondai's music, you might like John Adams or Louis Andriessen, and you know, the whole thing is basically you know, a recommendation service. It's the idea is to expose people to music that they might not otherwise hear, whether it's in a rock club or a more formal concert hall.
And that sort of brings up a related question. Tyondai, I'll let you start with this one. When you design your concerts, or even when you compose your music, do you think about what critics will think of your music, in the sense that because of the type of music that you do, that some critics, especially classical music critics, might think that what you do is contrived, or that you are trying to be overly chic and cool in what you do?
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, I think any composer that's working on music that they're really invested in and really inspired by are too caught up with the fact that they're excited about composing to think about what the critics are going to think, because there's nothing that you're ever going to do, no matter what you do, that someone's going to like or going to hate, you know? So you have to kind of, no one would put that amount of effort into doing something that was contrived, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. You know, at the same time, though, I'll say I do consider my audience when I'm writing. You know, just as an audience member myself, I aspire to be, when I compose some of this music, I want to be sitting in the audience and enjoying it as well. So in that sense, I consider my audience as far as the effects that I would like to have them experience, but I don't think about it in terms of, you know, critical acclaim or not, because that's not up to me, you know.
And one of the things that, as I researched both of your careers, one of the things that jumped out at me was that you guys do both classical and what's considered rock and roll. And as I kept reading about you guys, the person I kept thinking about was Frank Zappa. And in the sense that he did the same thing. He went from one genre to the other. But you guys seem to combine the two. And do you do that on purpose? How do you decide what percentage of one you do over the other? You with programming and you with composition?
I think that it's a different time from when Zappa was around. And I think that a lot of that information, as far as genre and style, have been assimilated into culture in a way where the lines are a little more blurred, so you can be more subtle in your composition. For instance, with Central Market, I love a lot of large symphonic classical music. I also love a lot of different kinds of electronic music, and it wasn't a contrived, like that word, I wasn't a contrived thing of like, you know, 1, 2, and just smash it together. It was more of just like the journey of going through all the different types of music that I've enjoyed over the years, and what I'm thinking about now. The result of that journey is what I'm making now. You know, it's more about that. Whereas, I mean, I can't speak for Frank Zappa, but just in the way that you used him as an example of just taking 1 and 2 and combining it together, I don't really feel like I'm doing that so much as it just being like a natural combination of my interests. I doubt he would say that he was doing that as well. Maybe, I'm sure he just had kind of a different style.
Yeah, and I think that he was, he didn't seem to combine the two.
Yeah.
He kept them separate as far as I could tell.
Right, well, you know, I think he brought a lot of the complexity of composition into rock music. I think there was some kind of crossover. Maybe there was a little bit more of a gap between the two. So I could relate to him in that way. It's funny though, I will say that, you know, there have been a lot of comparisons between this last record I did and Frank Zappa, and the irony is, when I was younger, I really didn't like Frank Zappa's music at all.
Why not?
Well, I thought that he was too funny, and I thought that his sense of humor was too obvious, and that the lines that he was drawing were too, it just felt too obvious to me. But as I've kind of gotten older, there's works of his that aren't as popular, that you start to see where a lot of his genius is. So even now, I kind of have a weird thing with Zappa. I respect him, I respect his world, but I can't totally relate to him on some ways. And it's the comparisons between us for this last record makes me want to investigate him more to see what about him I'm not interested in, and if I'm actually a part doing what I'm not interested in some ways.
And Ronen, what about you as far as your programming? I know that you do the concert series at Poisson Rouge. Now, how does that series differ from your Wordless music series?
Well, Le Poisson Rouge, is a full-time nightclub. It's open 7 nights a week. They do 2 concerts every night, and we often do, a string quartet program early and then a DJ set or something late. It's sometimes by design, it's sometimes by accident. I mean, I would say that in terms of just kind of proportioning it, any concert that you see, the format is pretty much set. There's a first half and a second half and an intermission, 1 or 2 different openers. And I would say that, as I hope you'll find with the case tonight, you try to make kind of a case or an argument, even though it may not seem that way, such that, you have the first piece and then you have the second piece and the third piece. And by the end of the night, ideally, the conclusion is some kind of synthesis of what has come before, or it's kind of led to. And tonight we tried to make it kind of literal, where, at first you'll see 2 people on stage, then 10 people, then 20 odd people, and then the full ensemble at the end. But every show is different, every artist is different, and I would say that, maybe to go back to what you were saying earlier, we had a similar conversation with John Schaefer from WNYC after the show at Lincoln Center on Monday night, and I think it's worth mentioning. I think Frank Zappa would really love to be alive in a time like this right now, because a lot of the fights that he had to have and a lot of the struggle for recognition that he had to have is just sort of taken for granted today. I think that a lot fewer people spend time wondering, whether someone like Sigur Rós is classical music or whether it's rock music, whether an album like Central Market, fits neatly into one of these little boxes. I think that that's one of the great things about living in 2011 is that, in the same way that an iPod can be playing John Coltrane and then it can go to Chopin or Debussy, the iPod makes no distinctions between that. It doesn't say one is better or different. It just says one comes before the other in this order. And I think, to speak for Ty, I think that that's maybe how a lot of our musicians approach things. Is not that Debussy is up here and Thelonious Monk is down here. It's that they're all different parts of this conversation and that we all have something to learn from each of these people.
Yeah, it's been neutralized in a lot of ways. The genre wars, as far as any kind of hierarchy or any kind of distinction between what can mesh and what can't. I think, Ronen is right. I feel like that war is kind of over at this point.
Is it? Well, the reason I said that, because I was sitting here thinking while you were talking that outside your career spheres, do you think that there's still a big dichotomy between rock and roll and classical in the mainstream biz? For instance, are places like Lincoln Center, Kennedy Center, are they doing concerts where the 2 genres are meshed? Or do they, or as you go around the country and around the world, do you see venues and concert series being combining the genres or keeping them separate as far as straight ahead classical music and then straight ahead rock and roll?
I think there will always be a kind of institutional element to some of these things, in the sense that, there is a specific, classical music is a specific culture, electronic music is a specific culture, and, the guardians of that will always want to preserve what the foundation of that is for each respective kind of thing. But at the same time, I feel like in the time that we're living in now, there's a split between the preservation of what those genres are, or whatever that means, and this new kind of hybrid approach, at least. You know, I feel like it's less of a big deal. It's less sacred to be able to kind of move between the two, which isn't to say that there's not going to be, you know, people that hold on to the original and promote the original idea or the original genre, that whatever you're talking about.
Now tonight we're going to be hearing music from your most recent, I want to say album, your most recent recording.
That's fine.
Central Market, and the title of which is a salute, I guess, to the opening scene of Stravinsky's Petrushka. Do I have that right? And go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, in the press release for that record, there was a lot of Stravinsky talk. I mentioned it to the person who I was talking to, so it kind of went crazy. So you know, it's just like, oh, Stravinsky. It's like an easy thing, but he was one of the people for sure that I was referencing. In particular, I did hone in on Petrushka as far as the scene that was created, the fair. But I just wanted to state that, just because a lot of people have been like, oh, cool, it's like Stravinsky 2011. I'm like, yeah, it's not like that. It's not totally like that.
No, but I do remember hearing a lick, a Stravinsky lick, as I listened to Central Market. I said, oh yeah, I recognize that. And then of course you talked about your relationship to, or you also liked the Song of the Nightingale. Now, how did that come into play into what you were doing here?
I didn't quote any part of the actual piece, but I did hone in on, I really appreciated that Song of the Nightingale was composed by Stravinsky right after The Rite of Spring. And so, you know, at that point in his career, he was already a superstar, and he already kind of, after The Rite of Spring, really mastered his language. So by the time he got around to doing Song of the Nightingale, he was really comfortable and fluid in the way that he worked. So it was really a very economic way of composing, very fluid. So I really appreciated his sense of timing and the tools that he was using. Was just he just kind of did everything right in that piece. So I was trying to kind of, if anything, take a lot from his decision making compositionally, as opposed to taking, you know, like a riff or something, or not you can't call it a riff, I guess, a phrase.
Yeah, and you're talking about the orchestral suite, not the complete opera.
Yeah, the orchestral suite, yeah.
Now, one of the things that I thought was interesting when I was reading about Central Market was the association with your music and your compositional processes in terms of your music being very expansive, in the sense that it could be, you've used your music in, it's been used by dancers and it's been choreographed, and you've also used your music in visual art spaces. Did you, when you're writing a piece of music, do you consider these issues, or did it just work out that way?
I think I really enjoy composing narrative-based music, not necessarily applied to one thing or another. I was excited at the prospect of having a ballet company, you know, choreograph something to that music, and I'm also interested in seeing what other visual artists would do with something like that. So, but it wasn't specific. I feel like just the nature of the music, I like, it's colorful, and it has like a sense of, it has a narrative sense to it, but without being explicit, I think.
Did you have to adapt any of your music to these other projects?
No. The one thing I did have to do, as far as adaptability is concerned, is rescore a lot of the music for tonight's performance. It still sounds, you know, the same, but, you know, I would have to, you know, when you're in the studio recording and you have an idea, it's as easy as just turning on a new, or, you know, Control N on Pro Tools, and that's a new track. So you're just like, oh, and you just like throw, you know, whatever on it. And, you know, and then suddenly you have to kind of pare down and realize what forces you're working with. And so I did have to kind of reconfigure some of the ideas. But that was the most reconfiguring I had to do.
Yeah, yeah. Now, Ronen, what do you think of the arts management and concert presenting in this day and age, vis-a-vis what you do? Do you see any kinds of trends? Are things becoming more and more cyber-oriented? What do you see from your perspective?
Well, you know, I can mainly speak for New York since that's where I live, and I present concerts there, and that's where I got my start. I mean, for me, you know, one of the most exciting things about both being a musician and a concert producer these days is just how little it really takes for a musician to get noticed. You know, during the 20th century, there were, you know, countless people who were kind of toiling away in isolation for many years, and whether their music ever got heard by a concert-going public or by a record-buying public was, you know, sometimes a little random. But, you know, now, today, a kid can make tracks in his bedroom and upload it to a MySpace page or a Facebook page, and within a week, you know, literally a week, find themselves, you know, talked about in Pitchfork and Rolling Stone and selling out, you know, very large venues. It can be a good thing. It can be also kind of a bad thing, and that people, you know, find themselves with a gigantic audience maybe before they're ready for it. But, you know, I would say that today, you know, the internet really has been very good and very bad for music. It's been great just in that any human being, you know, who has kind of a self-educating, self-motivating impulse can really learn about medieval music, Renaissance music, modern music from their house, and, you know, with just a credit card and a couple of mouse clicks. The downside to this, I think, is that we have really gained a tremendous amount in terms of quantity, and, you know, you could never really listen to all the music that's out there. But, you know, you'd be lying if you said that it wasn't hard to get people to sit and actually focus for an entire record. You know, the art of listening to a 45-minute record from start to finish, I don't want to say it's endangered, but you can rapidly see how many people have difficulty with it. You know, but I really envy kind of young people who, you know, are 15 today and are really first learning about music. When I was 15, which was only 15 years ago, but it seems like longer, you know, you couldn't hear an album unless your friend loaned you a CD, and people don't have that anymore. You can really learn about anything. You just have to be a bit of a self-starter, and I think that music has only benefited from that.
And what are your thoughts about this?
I was going to say, just to add to that, the one great thing about the internet, though, that has really changed the game from when I was a kid and growing up, you know, playing in punk bands and stuff, is that, you know, you had kind of a monopoly within the industry of sorts, and you had this kind of false sense of choice between these different groups, and it was kind of very major label controlled. So they gave you like a false sense of choice, like, oh, you could pick up, you know, Chemical Brothers, or you could pick up Mariah Carey, and it's like, oh wow, I love all different kinds of music, Mariah Carey and Chemical Brothers. It's so different, and it's all released on the same record, and it's all controlled by the same people. So you'd have, like, I don't know, maybe in the 90s even 30 huge bands, and so you would kind of have to pick and wade between these bands if you didn't know about underground music or weren't interested enough to go searching. Nowadays, with the internet, that has really crippled that sense of false variety, and there's no such thing as that major label dominance doesn't exist anymore. So it allows, you know, whereas it does allow a lot of the quantity to rise up, and you have to kind of wade through a lot of, you know, people just uploading stuff online, it still levels the playing field in a way that's really cool, in a way that I think is healthier for just culturally speaking. And I feel like you get a better sense of what's going on in the world with this way of working, as opposed to this, you know, false sense of or this kind of dictated mantra of this person represents this, and that's why this person's the leader of the generation, and then there's this, you know, it's just like this kind of false information that can't really happen anymore. Like, you know, you look at bands like Radiohead and, you know, who else is it? Like Nirvana or something, and those kind of bands are done. Like, I mean, that kind of model for bands is done. I don't think there'll ever be another band that's as huge as Radiohead, you know, was in the 90s, because there was only a few kind of people to select from. And it's cool. So it just has, it has like a lot of musicians working hard, and if you're going to tour and if you're going to kind of promote yourself, you can kind of rise up a little bit from the top as far as people that are just kind of doing it, putting their music online and just kind of staying home. You could, if you're willing to work hard, you can get your music out.
And so, but how do you separate, you know, the wheat from the chaff? I mean, I mean, you can't just sort of go through.
Well, but you know, like, isn't that kind of what we did anyway? Like all the dumpster diving, you know, record collectors who you'd have to drive out of town to go to that one record store that had that rare release, you know, and then you'd be that guy who's like, oh, I have this rare release, and you're, you know, so in a way, if you're a real music lover, you kind of have to do that anyway. You have to kind of like weed through the stuff. You know, I feel like that hasn't really changed. I feel like it's just the stuff that you have to wade through now is more visible, maybe, you know, and maybe more of an obstruction because there's more of it. But I think that's a small price to pay for kind of evening the odds a little bit.
When you, now, earlier in your career, you were a little bit more, it was interesting because you went to the art school first in Lucarelli. That's why I remember. And, but then, so you started out as a classical musician. No?
No, I wouldn't say that.
Well, but you were at the art school. So.
I was at the art school, but I wouldn't say, if you asked me back then, I guess you're going down the classical music road, I would have definitely disagreed with you. I went to art school because I wanted to understand the fundamentals of you know, music theory. So if I wanted to be able to express an idea to a musician, I could do it quickly, but not because I necessarily subscribed to you know, I'm going to this school, so I'm this kind of a person. You know what I mean? I was there for the information to be able to kind of use for myself.
So that's the way you presented yourself, and that's the way you were accepted when you were at the school?
Yeah, I could tell you this, I was very cautious going to that school because, you know, there's a lot of things that are scary about going to a conservatory, whether it be music or art or anything, because, you know, if you're going into an undergrad program, you're around 17, something like that, and you don't want to, you know, at least for me, I was really scared of being brainwashed. I was really scared of falling into, you know, like, oh, I have to be this certain person to appreciate this kind of music, and I just wanted the information. You know, I didn't want the sensibility necessarily that goes along with it. So yeah, I was very conscious about that kind of thing.
And did your teachers, and did they leave you alone? Did they allow you to follow your own path?
Yeah, they did. They did. It's more so the environment. It's a collective thing. It's not just the teachers, it's the students. It's the way the whole thing is connected. So I was working on a lot of electronic music in that environment, and that's what I wanted to do, and that's what I was interested in. But I could also say that maybe subconsciously it was also a little bit more of a reaction to be able to like feel like I had my own world to exist in, and not feel like I was, you know, just like a kind of a drone that just like came in and was like, yes sir, major thirds, and you know, I was worried about that at the time.
Yeah. Now, did your father have any influence on your career? How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, he's, you know, I could definitely say he's definitely my primary influence, especially growing up. You know, your parents form your world for you, and if one of your parents is this really enthusiastic composer who's, you know, showing you a way of living that is incredibly exciting, and that, you know, if your own blood is showing you that you can create these whole worlds from nothing, and all you have to do is be excited about it, and then just follow it. That was incredibly influential. I will say the second I realized I really wanted to do music, the one thing I took away from him the most, more than any particular musical idea, was that I had to find my own way. I had to be separate from him in certain ways so I could find my own path. Otherwise, I would just be, you know, kind of just a product. I would just be like son of guy, you know, and that was the last thing I wanted, because I really did realize I loved music. So I wanted to respect the fact that I loved it and kind of find my own way. But you know, he's an incredible influence on me. I love his music, and it's kind of hard to calculate all the things that he did for me, just as far as my being able to stay motivated and, you know, be able to see someone that's doing this thing and just like a freight train is continuing, you know.
Did he ever coach you in your compositions, or did he? How did he work with you? Did he work with you directly?
When I was really young, I took clarinet lessons from him, and then I took clarinet lessons, and then I turned 13 or 14, and I heard like the Sex Pistols, and I got a guitar, and I was like, I don't want to play clarinet anymore. Get away from me. And so then there was that, you know, teenage rebellion gap. But then in college, when I was in school with composition, I really started to feel like I was grasping the fundamentals a little bit more. To balance off that, I took, you know, he teaches classes at Wesleyan University, which is just like an hour away or 2 hours away from the Hart School of Music, which is where I went. So I would go to his composition systems class, and that was incredible. That was like one of the most, you know, I lived with the guy for my whole life, and so obviously that philosophy is embedded in you in one way or another. But to actually go to a formal thing and really see how he teaches and how he, goes about his way of showing his students, it was really amazing. So that was. But besides that, you know, unfortunately, we've never played together. It's never really gone beyond that.
Mm-hmm. You know. You all know who we're talking about. Anthony Braxton is Tyondai's father. So just so everybody knows that. I think at this point we're going to open up for a couple of questions. Does anybody have a question?
Oh.
What is your influencer? We heard what your influencer was. Sure. Do you have a major influencer?
James Joyce. I don't know. I'm not a musician, I should say. I was a literature major in school and still can't read music, can't play an instrument. So about 5 years ago, I began doing these wordless music concerts, and you know, it's a nice way to earn a paycheck, just hanging with your friends and encouraging them to do musical projects. The extremely condensed and least boring version is I was working for a couple years at Lincoln Center in New York, and I was working as a grant writer. I had never booked a concert in my life, and I spent about half the week seeing classical music uptown at Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center, and I would spend the other half of the week at clubs in Brooklyn and the Lower East Side. And at the time, I was especially interested in, you know, what is called badly the genre of post-rock, which is basically rock instrumentation, rock kind of personnel, but not pop-based songs, long kind of instrumental suites. And while I was at Lincoln Center, I asked one day a colleague of mine, I said, you know, what is this thing called chamber music that we're, you know, working to preserve? And she said, well, you know, it's music made by small groups of people in a fairly intimate space. And I asked her, you know, I said, okay, well, last night I went to the Mercury Lounge, which is a club with room for 200 people on Houston Street in the Lower East Side. And I said, they had a violin, a viola, a cello, a laptop, and a drum kit. I said, is that chamber music? And she said, no, I don't really think it is. And I said, how come? And she said, well, you know, at Carnegie Hall, when you see the Emerson String Quartet play, it's considered rude to lean over your neighbor and say, wow, this is a really cool concert, whereas That's Okay at the Mercury Lounge. And I said, that's really the whole distinction between the two. And that was the point when she kicked me out of her office. So I knew we were maybe onto something. And that was really the seed into this idea of just putting two seemingly dissimilar things next to each other. And what you find is that they have maybe more in common as a result than you might have guessed.
Yes, ma'am.
So, each of you has referred kind of awkwardly to like album, record, you know, the terminology, and I'm way beyond, I don't know, you know, 10-year-olds these days whose only music accessing is downloading iTunes. I don't know if they relate to any of those words at all, but I'm curious in terms of how you put a CD together. I assume you still give consideration to the sequencing and the total experience that you want the listener to have. But how are you adapting as the creator to the changing scenery? So that's a slightly different slant on the question that you asked a bit earlier.
I think, you know, I do still look at what a whole record or album, whatever you want to call it, is in the framework of that, because I'm still interested in, you know, the ebb and flow of a large work. I'll admit with this record I just did, it's still split up into tracks that you could probably just play, you know, one that you can isolate something that you like as opposed to feeling like you have to listen to the whole thing. So I tried to find a way of kind of reconciling those two things. You know, people say, you know, the LP is dead, the album is dead, and you know, here we are in the iPod generation, the shuffle generation, and it's all 2-minute songs, and if it doesn't connect within the first 30 seconds, it's over. And maybe there is some, maybe that's kind of where we're at in some places, but I still believe in the record, you know. I still believe in the record. You gotta believe in the record.
Yes, sir.
I received a thing in the mail from Guitar Center like some odd years ago, and I had been a fan of the old band. And in the article, you had said you liked the idea of taking, you know, digital things and giving it a more organic feel. Do you feel like doing that with an orchestra or classical idea has kind of branched that out even more? Yeah.
You know, there's nothing more musical than imperfection. And when you hear something perfect, it doesn't sound musical, at least to me. Like maybe that's wrong. Maybe, you know, maybe I'm cutting myself off by saying that. But the things that excite me are the things that are organic. So I try to take things that are synthetic, like electronics and like, in some cases, samples or something, and dirtying them up in a way that makes it feel more real, you know. And the orchestra is you know, I guess ironically, the orchestra is an extension of that, when really the orchestra is more of a root of that kind of philosophy. It is, those instruments are completely imperfect. You know, the buzz of the strings on the violin, you know, if your embouchure is wrong, the trumpet's, you know, something weird. So I guess electronic music is kind of mimicking, I try to mimic that through electronic music a little bit, so it feels a little bit more, you know, it has a little bit more substance, I feel like, when you have the, when you have the potential to do something wrong, then you have a larger palette you're playing with, as opposed to if you just have the potential to do something right, maybe.
But how do you separate being more organic? That implies sort of, you know, live performances as opposed to recordings where you can go back and fix it. So when you're talking about organic, are you talking about using special effects or effects in your music? You're not talking about adding wrong notes or doing stuff that's purposely out of tune, or are you?
I think it depends on the project. Technically, yes, I would say I am. I would say for this particular project, though, it was more of an environmental thing where I wanted to record all the sounds in a way that was that felt more real. For instance, you could take a keyboard and plug it directly into an interface for a computer and just play, so there'll be no environment. You can add reverb or something later, and it has a synthetic thing. Whereas for this, every single thing that we recorded for Central Market, the strings or the synthesizers, we either ran it through an amp or we ran it through a giant PA in this gallery. So it would all kind of mesh together in this kind of imperfect room, and the refractions would sound kind of weird in certain cases, so we kept that. But as far as keeping wrong notes, I didn't do that with this because I really wanted the pieces to be perfect in that Deutsche Grammophon kind of way. Like, you know, I really wanted to kind of reference that world of having like these really perfect sounding orchestra pieces, but with the variable that would be strange would be the environment. So that was kind of my way, if that makes sense. I don't know where I just went just now, but
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering what your favorite instrument to jam on is and why.
Huh. Well, I've played guitar the longest, but guitar, you know, if you've been playing an instrument long enough, it gets boring. I still like playing guitar. I like playing keyboard. Maybe I'd say voice, because you can actually, you know, everyone's virtuosic with their voice. If you have an idea, especially with these new iPhone apps, you can, you know, you have that like voice recorder thing. So you could often find me like a crazy person walking down the street singing into my phone. And, you know, so I use kind of composition that way. So I think maybe that's my favorite, because I'm good at that, just kind of like anyone else is good at that.
Well, I think on that note, we will have to cut off. We get Tyondai and Ronen backstage so they can get ready to do the concert. So would you please give them another hand?
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov. This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.